Homophobic parents made my life hell for 2 months, so I gave them a taste of their own medicine. Background. So back when I was 15, I had a father who would call Deadbeat Joe. Deadbeat Joe was the stereotypical deadbeat father, as he almost never contacted me of his own volition, and he resisted paying my mother child support whenever he could because he hated her as she left him, and took his baby away from him, so he took it out on me, his words not mine. My mother, being the saint she was, never talked bad about him, and tried to endorse a relationship between us throughout my entire childhood. I did love Deadbeat Joe and would often want to spend time with him, but to no avail, because he was always busy getting his dick wet with some rather questionable women. So I was basically forgotten about by him until the few occasions when he realized he remembered that he did have an older son. Because of that, I was raised by my mother and my stepfather, who I call Dad. They really loved and still do love me, and they worked their asses off to make sure that I was well cared and provided for. And fortunately, me and my family had to move away to another state when I was 12, which meant that my parents ended up buying a house, which we moved into. Now, something to mention, up to this point, we were very poor, and my parents ended up buying a house after getting a great deal for it. However, the house was in as very poor quality, and my parents didn't know that, so we ended up basically getting scammed. My mother lost her job, and over time we ended up becoming so poor that we ended up having to rely on food banks to supply us with the food necessary to survive. Luckily, or rather unluckily, Deadbeat Joe and his new wife, who we call Chris, said that they'd take me in and that they had a good, decent quality of life, which my parents bought. Because to my mother, Deadbeat Joe didn't really seem like the type of guy who would lie about something that big. So despite my objections, I hated Deadbeat Joe by this point. I went to go live with Deadbeat Joe and Chris plus their kids, due to the fact that my real parents were about to lose our home at the time, and they didn't want me to be homeless along with them. At first they were very welcoming, but after a few weeks things started to change. Both Chris and Deadbeat Joe had lied, and they were just as poor as my parents were. Over time, Chris had started to show the volatile side of herself, and Deadbeat Joe found out I was gay, which was a problem due to the fact that he was very Christian. They both really hated how I was LGBT despite claiming otherwise, as Deadbeat Joe felt that I needed mental help because he felt that being gay was an illness. They tried to force me to conform to their beliefs that being gay was wrong, but I refused, which made them very angry. Chris also ended up just being horrible and manipulative to me on a regular basis, as she would do things like set up a schedule for the time of when us kids could do certain things, refused to let me go to school for no good reason, threatened to isolate me from her entire family if I didn't do what she wanted me to, etc. Due to all of this, it caused me a lot of stress and anxiety over the 2 months I stayed there, and I would cry a lot in the corner of my room, wishing that the fuses that kept breaking would set the house on fire and take me with it. It built up a lot of anger and resentment within me, and all of the things that Chris and Deadbeat Joe would do and say to me. After a while, the hostility in the house built up, and I would eventually be accused of being a pedophile who wanted to molest my brothers because Chris said that someone looked up child porn on her cell phone. Deadbeat Joe ended up taking away my phone and threatening me with knives, which culminated to me taking my phone back and running away to hide in the bushes outside of the trailer park we lived in. The cops came. My parents manipulated the situation to make it seem like I was a terrible child, and they left. The next week was a living hell afterwards, as Chris and Deadbeat Joe kept trying to get a confession out of me and kept threatening me, but I held my ground and was able to leave their house and move back in with my parents. By this point, I was seething with rage, but I didn't do anything to them as I wanted to move on. However, a month after I left her house, I remembered the smug face Chris made throughout the week she kept me a prisoner in her house and kept trying to ruin my life. I decided that I hated her too much to not retaliate against her and her husband. So that's what I ended up doing. The revenge. I decided that I would sign Chris up for all the spam junk mail I could find, using the information I could find online and on the school directory of the school she worked at. Looking to hear the sacred word of Scientology? Click. Want to hear about our shitty products that will fall apart after one use? Click. Want to see some hot, sexy women get it on with each other? Click, click, click. Next, I decided to send Chris' family some recordings I took of some of the things that she would say to me during my stay at Chris' house, I had recorded the things that she was saying to me, so I had evidence to show my parents that she was abusing me. I ended up sending those recordings to all of her close friends and family before blocking them. They were very bad, so it wouldn't have surprised me if some of them ended up distancing themselves from her after listening to it. Lastly, I decided that I would continue to make Deadbeat Joe pay my mother for what he owed her in child support. I was originally going to ask my real dad to adopt me, but after learning of how much money Deadbeat Joe had to send my mother, around $1,200 per month, I did the math and concluded out of spite that I would let my mother keep on milking him for what he was worth until I turned 18. It's going to be quite a bit of time before I become an adult too, as currently I am 16. So by the time I have turned 18, DJ will have to legally pay my mother $25,000 over the next few years of my life, which is definitely not something to sniff at. Resolution. I never heard back from my evil parents after I carried out my revenge against them, so I don't really know how their immediate reaction towards what I'd done. However, after going back to the school directory to see if any changes were made to it, I discovered that almost all of the teachers in full was scrubbed from the site and my stepmother's name was nowhere to be found. I connected the dots and it made me realize that I had caused an entire site-wide change. And the reason why I had never heard back from my abusive parents was because of how badly I had humiliated Chris. And I knew that Chris would have flogged Deadbeat Joe if he dared try to talk to me again. After realizing this, I laughed so hard I almost pissed myself and I left the school's website. Currently, I am studying for an exam that will earn me certification in an aspect of designing, which is important for the field I want to get into. I am taking my education seriously, and I now have opportunities that I wouldn't have been afforded had I stayed at Chris' house. I have made some new friends and have now moved on from the things that my parents did to me. The LDR, evil homophobic bio-dad and stepmother make my life a living hell for 2 months. I enact my revenge and now they have to pay my real parents $25,000 over the next 2 years of my life and have gotten outed as abusers to their family and friends.
Mess with the dominatrix and you'll cry. Or it's NSFW, mobile, no native English. I work as a cam girl, doing video chats with guys for money. Most of the sessions I have are fetish-related and I work for many small sites. One day I had a guy wanting to be my slave, meaning he wanted me to be a dominatrix, and to command him to perform painful and degrading acts on himself. Most of these so-called slaves are actually very soft-core in what they are willing to do. Initially, he paid for a 1-hour session, and we got along so well he paid for a second hour. At the start of the session, I always set up a safe word and we talk about turn-ons, limits, and I respect them. It's part of the dom-sub dynamic to build a trustful relationship. I did the session. He seemed happy and so was I. He was indeed very soft-core. A month later, the site owner messaged me to say that a client contacted him accusing me of fraud, threatening to call the police. He said I blackmailed him to make him send money and never delivered the session. I showed the screenshots of the conversation, so I was off the hook with the site and they didn't issue a refund. But the guy asked for a charge back in his credit card company and I had around $400 deducted from my paycheck. It's important to stress that services of sexual nature have very different billing rules. It's against the terms of service of all the mainstream payment processors, such as PayPal, Venmo, Google Pay, etc. You have to own a high-risk merchant account with very high fees, so we use third-party companies that facilitate it for us. Some of them cover these eventual chargebacks, others don't. This one didn't. Fast forward 6 months. I was contacted on Skype by a guy wanting to be my slave for 1 hour. This is not a rare request, so I didn't connect the dots at first. I sent him a link for payment, luckily this time in a site that covered chargebacks. He paid. When he opened his camera, there he was. I never forgot his face and accent because he was very weird. It was the same guy who accused me of fraud and got his money back. I have terminated the call right away, but knowing I was protected by chargeback in this other site, I decided to get my revenge, so I pretended I haven't recognized him. Knowing he was soft-core but willing to obey, I started to give him tasks that were literally turn-offs for him. I didn't set up a safe word this time. I let it escalate quickly to very hardcore stuff and used all the mind games to push him to his limits. He went 20 minutes straight. He was crying until he gave up and hung up on me. I even called back a few times and he didn't answer. I clearly stated that his remaining minutes were forfeited because he left the session on his own will. A week later, the owner of the site asked for proof of the session because the client contacted him saying the service wasn't delivered and he wanted a refund. I had everything documented. They paid for the time, not for the actions. So whatever happened in the session is at our own discretion. He never got the refund, and this site is a chargeback protection, so he didn't get the money back this time. He is blacklisted now and never heard from him again. I hope he left the BDSM world for good. TLDR, submissive guy booked online session with a dominatrix, made false accusations to get his money back. 6 months later, he show up again. I pretend I didn't recognize him and made he do things he didn't like until he hung up crying.
Check out my other great videos.